By having to cut up reality into language, we lose truth value, but we really can't help it. Where language is on point, we learn and cooperate. When language is inaccurate, we misunderstand each other. Where language doesn't exist, we are unable to transport meaning. Language itself shapes how we process reality, and by communicating, we unavoidably interpret. Our game, Overwatch, is one with a limited history and thus less sophisticated language, and yet overwhelming complexity. We seem to have mostly unsatisfying answers to the questions: where's the enemy? What comp do they run? What style do they play? What's his role? Language ideally is as self-explanatory as possible, and while maximizing accuracy. Accuracy and ease of access constantly stands at odds with each other. So let's dive into a couple of issues with Overwatch that I found also in talks with friends in the scene, and also things that I've absorbed and now have sort of like boiled up in me, also by people like Kirby, who constantly brought up these issues. So let's give a couple of talking points from Kirby here. So Kirby has before talked about the problems in naming specific comps. So he was, for instance, someone who talked about how you would refer to 2-2-2 comps. Why not just call them 2-2, I think was his point. And these certain classifications certainly caused issues in the past, and as I will outline in a bit, still probably do. There were issues with role names. So for instance, one thing that he called out was, what about flex tanks? Can we really say that someone is a flex tank if for the last year 90 to 95% of the flex tank role was D.Va? Is that a fair assessment? Now the idea of off-tank has taken hold in the community, but at the same time, isn't everyone sort of now flexing? Is flex not dead? Isn't it all flex everything? So where's the language here? Where is it flex support, right? So let's start with comps, for instance. So over the first season, for instance, we saw different variations of what we call dive. So despite, for the vast majority of the history of Overwatch, the dive comp being D.Va, Winston, Tracer, Genji, then Zen and Lucio, or before Zen, Ana, it still was referred to as the same comp because presumably it was this one archetype, or the core of what made it so was consistently the same thing. The same hold true when we, for instance, switched to Mercy, when Mercy was very overpowered in Stage 1 of the Overwatch League, and then also later on when she was still the better support over Lucio. So that then forced us to still use the name Dive, but it wasn't really Lucio Dive, right? So here, a sort of loss in speed and also maybe a little bit of a different archetype could have been argued, but I don't mind the distinction here too much, and I don't think that's a problem in itself. Now, what happens if Widow enters the role? Suddenly people are talking about Widow Dive. Is it Dive still because D.Va, Winston, and Tracer on the team? It gets a little bit ambiguous here, and I'm not sure if by calling it Dive, we're actually really serving the purpose and aren't confusing people and aren't even confusing experts in itself. So the problem always seemed to be that our sort of descriptors weren't really effective or accurate, while at the same time you always have to see that you don't get too complicated. So what about the current state of affairs? So for instance, let's take goats. So one modifier we've been seeing is that people now say sometimes Ana goats instead of Moira, or Zen goats instead of Moira or Ana in that case. And when you say Ana goats, I think most people understand that this refers to this specific position. So also in the way the comp is played, it isn't fundamentally archetypically different, I would argue, even though it might be. So what happens when Break is switched out for Hanzo or Doomfist? Is it still goats? Is it archetype held? What if Ryan is switched to Winston? Still goats? It gets, a little bit murky, and we find issues with calling basically everything goats, or in fact none of it, or really that's one specific comp. Where's the line we draw? Where is it where we have to say this is accurate, this is inaccurate? Also things like, for instance, if we go back to the dive issue, sometimes dive comps by the composition that the heroes wasn't really played dive, but rather counter divey. So are we referring with dive as an archetype that's being played, and rather than a strategy or a tactic? What is it exactly that what we mean when we say dive? I'm not sure we had this public conversation, and I'm not sure if I have a satisfying answer for myself at this point. And I've discussed this with other experts in the scene, like Benchmob, like Dream, like Volamil, and it remains a hard issue to tackle. Now, for instance, other scenes, like, for instance, the scene I came from way in the past in World of Warcraft, we solved this but with abbreviations at times. So what would happen is, for instance, the most well-known comp at the time that's apparently still feasible was called RMP, Rogue Mage Priest. Simply the type of heroes, or rather characters, that you play, and therefore it was very easy to identify. RMP then also became a household name for that comp. Everyone knew what it referred to. Through reiteration and public consensus, we had a nice abbreviation that everyone knew what it meant. RLS was one thing. Then we sometimes, for some of these, had archetypical names like Caster Cleave, Spell Cleave, these types of things that, from what I could gather, still are within the scene and still have feasible names, but the question is how similar do they play still, right? Now, let's transport that back to Overwatch. What can we do? So, for instance, goats, if I was to, employ this RMP thing, this abbreviation thing, it would be something like Arzavabu Moilu, right? Like Ryan, Zarya, Diva, because you can't say D because there's Doomfist, then B for Bridget, and then Moi for Moira, and then Lucio. Like, it's very hard. You see, like, this almost sounds like an African language at this point, right? So it is quite hard to come up with sensical things. So then what we did was simply take these and then sort of try to put names on them. Very early in the beta, we had god comps, right? We had these pre-dive scenarios where there were two double Genji, because we had no hero limits. Like, these comps seemed unbeatable, hence why they were called god comps, right? But often old language then gathers fast, and for instance, in the case of Flex Tank, that doesn't even seem functional anymore. And if new people come in, now the old heads all realize, okay, Flex Tank refers to the position of the second tank player that doesn't play these main tank roles, even though, now we have triple tank. This gets more and more ambiguous. It really shows the complexity of Overwatch and what kind of language problems we run into, right? But this isn't even just scraping the surface, because I think the biggest one are actually map callouts. So I remember somewhere that the devs specifically said that in creating these maps and designing them, they specifically try to theme different parts of the map in the way that the community could easily make up names for them and communicate them. But as far as I can tell, this, to the vast majority of the player base, definitely till probably GM, hasn't taken hold, and very few people have like an entire vocabulary of these map positions, and it's probably mostly a thing of organized teams that hasn't really dropped into or seeped through into the competitive ranked experience. While, for instance, games with a long history like CSGO, everyone knows where these positions are. They are very specific map callouts. They also have sometimes a cool history. For instance, if I think about Get Right, that's a place on Mirage I think it's bomb site A, between, these two little stairs and things like this. We don't have this yet. We probably either didn't have the history. Also, we have so much such an overwhelming amount of information, of maps, that's very hard to come up with them consistently. We are cycling through these maps so consistently, we can't just say we just want to play this one map and really hone it out and get it, unless you're in a scrim environment. So the overall player base can't really form consensus around these things. Now, here's one observation I made in myself, and as someone that sort of tries to be mindful of his own cognitive processes when thinking about games, I don't think I really perceive maps as artistic things, or could really, even beyond the general theme, tell you what the parts of the map are. So I couldn't tell you if there's a church on Dorado for the longest time, until someone pointed it out to me. To me, my cognition sort of perceives maps as geometrical objects, and unless someone gives me a name to put on that I hear frequently, I won't even see these things as anything but. I won't apply these labels. So in that sense, while it was a valiant effort, I don't think that that approach of trying to thematically change it by art really had any effect on me, and I have a hard time thinking that I'm the only one in this, right? It's also that other people in the past have tried to do something about it. For instance, the content creator and former pro player Spo comes to mind, who made very early in beta, actually, these colored maps where he took top-down maps, which were pretty hard to get hold of back in the day, and then he would color them up and would name them in order to sort of have nice little chunks where people could constantly say, okay, they are there, they are there. Problem is, this once again hasn't arrived in the general community, and if we're talking about in ranked experiences, the only names I hear of enemy positions, for instance, is behind, or someone is top, or someone is on me, right? Like, this doesn't help me because I don't connect the voice to this player that I just met to his character, and can't really say who he's playing in the moment, or rather that would take so much cognitive, resources that it wouldn't really help me in that moment, would it? So in that sense, nothing really is accomplished. And I wonder if anything but these teams have these sort of things. And I wonder if we were to compare these languages that teams, or these vocabulary that the teams have accrued for themselves, if we were to put someone in, so for instance, let's say Dante going from Shock to the Outlaws now, I'm very confident that they have to learn a bunch of new words, map callouts, or the teams that went into the World Cup teams. I think there was a certain friction of trying to name these map callouts. Of course, some overlap will be there, but very specific positions that also could shape strategy, because someone has maybe found a very good Widowmaker angle and he stands there, but the reiterations haven't been high enough for the entire pro player base to know about this, so they don't have a specific location for that one. It shapes reality, and it also drags us apart in trying to frame them. And I wonder, the process of trying to learn these different language styles would probably be very beneficial to these pro players, to see how others name these specific map locations, because the names don't just tell you the descriptors, they also often will tell you the function of the position. So if someone says, for instance, God position or something, and then he is making a judgment about the position, for instance, of a Widowmaker, in a very good position that other teams probably haven't evaluated the same. So their value is to be found, but unless we get hold of these communication systems, we will never hear them. So I think one thing is to say, okay, we have a trickle-down approach, and hopefully through, you know, the top 500. So the pro players teach it to the top 500 players, and then it trickles down into diamond and then in the lower levels. Because I can tell you, even the average player in CSGO knows a lot of these map callouts. Well, barely anyone in Overwatch does, which in itself makes sense because we don't have that long history. But at the same time, it is now slowly becoming more and more concerning. And even if I talk to people about specific compositions that we run, I have to reframe. So for instance, it isn't a given that everyone understands what GOATS is, even at, you know, Masters or, you know, GM level in Europe. So the problem then is that you then have to explain what it is, what these people have to do. There's also strategical components involved. And as long as we haven't found a way to disseminate that language onto everyone, and then also to constantly discuss the sense of the language, to sort of, you know, to sort of care for the language that we use, I think we will have a problem. And by solving that issue, I think we also expand the understanding of the community tremendously and solve a lot of issues for us. Thanks for listening.